Now, Matthew Cappucci was another very popular guest, a controversial one, but a very popular one, on climate change just a few weeks ago. Since when the climate has been bucking like a bronco. It's boiling hot some places. It's a freezing cold summer where I live. And in America, there are floods. Boy, are there floods. So Matthew has kindly agreed to join us again on the Mother of All talk shows. Matthew, I don't know if you saw some of the criticism following our last discussion. I remember seeing you disdain to engage with some of it, which was simply ill-mannered and disrespectful. But if I were to summarize, it would be to say that they call you a climate change denier. I myself formed no such view of you. I, if anything, thought that you were relatively close to my own uneducated, untutored position, that there's always been climate change, and that whilst we should endeavour to live as clean a life as we possibly can, with as little waste as we can possibly produce, and with sustainability always in mind, we can't go back to the Stone Age to try and turn back the tide. That's my view. Am I wrongly ascribing it to you?
Well, certainly the climate always has changed. The issue is now that human action and human intervention is accelerating that change more quickly than our infrastructure can keep up. There's certainly nothing inherently bad in of itself in the conditions that we're expecting, but it's that our infrastructure isn't ready, so it has a net negative effect. So ultimately, I'm very confident that humans are altering the climate largely in pernicious ways. I think I get a lot of criticism, though, from sort of both sides of the aisle, in that there are people who think I don't sort of push climate change enough, and there are people who think that I make too much about climate change. And ultimately, I've realized there's no way to satisfy everybody. But I'm not in the business of here trying to satisfy people. I'm in the business of trying to communicate strictly the science that we know and strictly the implications of said science. And what we know is that the climate has always changed, but that human action is also causing significant climate change, and that we have to respond to that. And ultimately, our infrastructure is at risk.
Flooding is one of the things that tests our infrastructure most severely, isn't it? We have crumbling infrastructure in your country and in mine. In mine, much of the infrastructure that deals with water is from not even the 20th century, but oftentimes the 19th. Certainly my own is. The recent flooding in the United States, how has that affected your thesis, if at all?
One of the things that we know about climate change is that for every degree Celsius the air temperature increases, the air can hold about 7% more water, which means you start tacking on a couple degrees of net warming over the course of however long, that reflects in very high-end rainfall in these short little bursts. And that's exactly what we saw last week on Wednesday night in parts of the Mid-Atlantic in New York City and really the Northeast. We had areas that saw about 3.25 inches of rain in just 1 hour's time, so more than 8 centimeters in just an hour's time. So they're getting about a month's worth of rainfall in a single hour. And events like that are very strongly tied to climate change. In fact, in the northeastern United States, we've seen about a 55% increase in these ultra high-end climate change or climate-fueled rainfall events. And so we're very confident in the connection between very heavy rainfall and human-induced climate change. Now, other things, for example, like the tornado that hit Maryland, people were angry at me for not connecting that to climate change. And really, we're not confident in our connections there. So for me, it's about connecting what we know and not connecting what we don't. And some people get upset about that. Ultimately, it's a matter of sometimes science being incompatible with their worldview, whether they're very pro-climate, anti-climate, whatever. Ultimately, we know that floods are very much connected to climate change. We know that tropical activity is fueled by climate change, particularly in regard to rapid intensifying storms and storms that reach these high-tier Category 4, Category 5 strengths. as they did in the U.S. Gulf Coast. So there are things we know that are connected to climate change and other things that aren't really linked. And that's just kind of how it goes.
And I'm guessing that New York City's infrastructure isn't exactly tip-top. Is that how it turned out?
I think the city was built largely for 1 to 2 inches of rainfall per hour. When we get 3.5 inches of rain in a single hour's time, even more in some places, more than 4, the infrastructure just can't handle that. And when you consider, too, the result of urban sprawl, all these areas that now have pavement, that have cement, that are completely paved over and offer no area for the rainfall to drain, it starts funneling into the subway systems, grinding rapid and public transportation to a halt, and you get this cascading effect that has implications all across the city and really across the transportation sector. And so the infrastructure is aging. It is not what I would consider modern in many areas. Of course, many Americans believe it is modern just because they're provincial and haven't traveled much. I'd like to see a significant investment in infrastructure and really planning for these higher end events that in previous years might have only occurred once every 200 to 500 years. Now we might be talking every 15 to 20 years. So we need to sort of change the benchmark that we're planning for.
And how has this year's climate been? Is it markedly hotter this year? I must say it didn't feel that way to me.
So ultimately, when we talk about the climate of an area, it's a 30-year average. So naturally, we're expecting some ups and downs and some ups and downs. In Europe right now, parts of the area have been under a pretty good down. Parts of the southwestern United States have seen their warmest summer on record. And so there are ups and downs across the board. It's more just that the ups outweigh the downs at this point, and they're seeming to do so every year. Very confident we'll be in a top 10 warmest year on record. We'll have to wait until December to see, but really it's one of those things where now every year is kind of reaching one of those top tiers. Even if in a local area we're not running overly hot, globally the average is very much skewed warm, and that has the implications of more water vapor in the air or changing the jet stream and stuff like that.
Now, I absolutely concur with your view on infrastructure for lots of reasons, not only because of climate change. Infrastructure spending generates economic activity, it generates local demand, it provides jobs for people, it's a multiplier. I'm with you on that. I'm wondering what you think we should be doing to try and slow down the runaway train of climate change itself.
I think humans are inherently selfish in that anything we do right now realistically won't have much of a bearing on the conditions that we face. The climate is kind of like, as you said, a runaway train. And so slowing down a train or getting into reverse direction, which is unreasonable, it is very challenging and takes a long stopping distance or a long distance to change. And so in our lifetimes, we really don't have that much time to do so. The conditions are already moving. And even if we stopped emitting today, the climate would still continue to warm thanks to ocean outgassing of CO2 and thanks to all these other processes that are already in motion. And once you start tipping that scale, it's like dominoes. There are these reinforcing positive feedback mechanisms. So ultimately, we're not going to see an overnight change. We need to start playing the long game in that we need to understand any conditions or any actions we take aren't really going to help us that much. They'll help our children, our grandchildren, stuff like that. Getting policymakers to do that is telling them to be selfless, which is a challenge. The other thing I think we need to start doing is being smart about our infrastructure. Why are we building houses on stilts right next to the ocean when inevitably there's going to be a hurricane? It's going to be a strong hurricane somewhere. Why are we building in floodplains? Why are we planning our flooding infrastructure based on 100-year events rather than 500-year events? It's that we're making consciously poor decisions reinforced by the inveterate practices of yesterday's infrastructure building. And really, we're sort of reinforcing the old rather than trying to adopt the new.
But isn't, you talk of selfishness, much of the we've just had 2 weeks of the so-called Extinction Rebellion causing mayhem in London, not very environmentally conscious mayhem, I should say, at that. Left an awful lot of trash for people that are against trash. Their argument is essentially anti-growth. Whereas for someone like me, of my politics, I think that's selfish because they can live with no growth. They already live in a rich country, and they're almost always the children of quite wealthy people. It's other people that need growth, need the generation of more wealth, so that they can get themselves out of poverty in our kind of country and by extension across the world, so that the poor world can become more prosperous. How do you square that circle?
I think ultimately people won't do something unless, on the large scale, unless it is financially sensible for them. And that makes sense because there are a lot of people who are in financial situations where they don't have the extra money to invest in something that may be better for the planet long term. And I can't blame them. If I'm decent off, but if someone tells me I can buy a green car for $70,000, or I can buy my truck, I drive a gas guzzler for $30,000, I'm going to choose a $30,000 car because financially that's what's feasible for me. I can't afford a $70,000 car. Until that technology is made available in a financially competitive way and an economically friendly way, it won't be adopted. Now, in the United States, solar energy is cheaper than natural gas, than coal, but the government has historically tried to sort of stand in the way of solar and stand in the way of wind and stand in the way of these different projects because in many areas, votes are based on sort of votes come from communities that have built themselves around the dying fields of coal and the dying fields of sort of fossil fuels, which, yes, we still need for some things, but it seems like in some places people sort of resist change just because it's based on what they know versus sort of a hop into the unknown, even if the unknown is ultimately better and more financially feasible. So overall, I think people won't do anything unless it makes financial sense for them. Even I wouldn't. I know what the right answer is. The right answer is for me to drive a greener car, but I don't have that kind of money, so I can't do that. And until on the large scale that's made available for people, it's not going to happen.
That's fascinating stuff. Thank you, Matthew Cappucci. I hope you'll come back and talk to us again, but hopefully not in the wake of the kind of terrible flooding that we saw in New York. Thanks a lot for coming on the Mother of All talk shows.